Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's series of lectures where we take a look at the philosophy of ethics. Today's lecture will focus on the philosophy referred to as utilitarianism. So remember, in the philosophy of ethics, we ask questions such as, how do we know what the right action is? How do we know what a wrong action is? How do we know which actions are more right than others? What is it we should value? What is it that we should want out of life that would guide these sorts of decisions? And even though an action might be right, how do we know when we're obligated to do it? How do we know it's an action that would just be a nice thing to do versus an action that we are morally obligated to do? And we started taking a look at these questions with the famous trolley problem. And the way we thought about it last class was imagining a train coming down a track with 5 people tied down to the far end of the track. With the train headed right towards them, they are doomed. But you were luckily, or maybe not so luckily, standing next to a lever which could switch the train to move on to another track. But on that other track was one person tied down. What do? Do you pull the lever to save the 5, but causing the impending doom of the one? Or do you not do anything and allow the train to continue running over the 5 people? We use this to get a sense, last class, of your moral intuitions. What does your gut tell you about what the right or wrong action would be? However, Socrates tells us that we actually can find moral truths, that we can actually gain moral knowledge, not through intuition or just our emotions. We should not follow just our impulses, but we should think rationally about it. We can find those moral truths through reason. So if you were a person that said, no, I think the right thing to do is to pull the lever because I'd be saving 5 versus the one who would perish, you might be a consequentialist, meaning you were probably thinking that the best course of action was that which brings about the better consequence, right? You were thinking in terms of the result of the action. Now, the most famous example of a consequentialist philosophy was what I had you read today, utilitarianism. And you can think of this as the greatest happiness principle. This was brought forth to us by Jeremy Bentham first, and his moral reasoning was as follows. You do whatever brings about the greatest happiness for the greatest number. All right? So you pull the lever because you're saving 5 people versus the one. Who I had you read today was a younger acquaintance of Bentham, right? John Stuart Mill, who we also read in our lectures on free will. John Stuart Mill will phrase his moral reasoning this way. Actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. So you can think about the rationale in terms of doing this math of what the outcome would be for an action. Does this action promote the most happiness? Does this action cause more suffering? Well, then that sort of math tells you what the right action would be to do. What would be an advantage of this sort of philosophy? There is an actual account of a group of Navy SEALs who are in Afghanistan are about ready to do an operation against a terrorist group. And here they are on top of this hill doing their surveillance before they go in for the operation. And a group of Afghan farmers, 2 men and a young boy, approached them, right, with their herd, just innocent bystanders. Now, there's no trees, there's no places to tie them up, there's no way to detain them. What are their options? They realized quickly their options were either to allow them to live and move on with herding or to kill them, right? Ensuring that they wouldn't somehow communicate with the terrorist group that they're about ready to do some sort of operation. They couldn't just have one person stay with the farmers while the rest of them go in. All of them were needed for the operation. Most of the Navy SEALs said, we have to kill them because we can't risk the operation. We can't risk them telling other people that could risk the success of what we're about to do. But there was one Navy SEAL who had a voice in his head who said, this isn't right. We can't kill innocent people. So they listened to that person. They listened to his voice. Okay, we won't kill the innocent people. As a result, when they went in down below to do the operation, it turns out that the farmers eventually did pass word onto the terrorist group that the Navy SEALs were coming, and they ended up being ambushed. This one Navy SEAL who had the thought that we can't kill an innocent life, he actually survived the ambush. And he's quoted as saying, oh man, that was the stupidest, most southern fried, lame brain, idea. I can't believe we did that. I can't believe I stopped us from killing the innocent people because now all of my friends are dead and the mission was a failure. So one advantage of utilitarianism is that it gives you this really clear principle with a really intuitive goal. We're just going to alleviate the most suffering. We're going to promote the most well-being. Another benefit of utilitarianism, well, if you have some sort of principle, like we saw with that Navy SEAL, then it's universal, right? No matter what the situation, you're always going to say, okay, I can't do this because of my principle. Think about whether or not you have a principle that says, yeah, I shouldn't lie, right? No lying. That's just the right thing to do. I just shouldn't lie. Regardless of consequences, I just shouldn't lie. Well, what if you were in Germany when the Nazis were trying to rile and gather up the Jews, and you were nice enough, kind enough to hide some Jewish people, a Jewish family in your basement to keep them safe from the Nazis? But here come the Nazis knocking your door and they ask you, do you have any Jewish people stored or kept here? If your principle is, I can't lie, then you would be compelled by that principle to tell the Nazis where the Jewish family is hiding in your house. Does that seem right? So utilitarianism provides us with an ability to apply this moral reasoning to specific situations. So we're not bound to some sort of rule, right? That you should never kill or you should always tell the truth. No, with utilitarianism, you can apply this sort of principle to very specific situations and determine what you think the right or wrong thing to do is. So what do you think? What do you think about this form of moral reasoning? For utilitarianists, for utilitarians like Mill, there are a couple of key principles to keep in mind here, right? First, the well-being here, right? Happiness is the ultimate moral good, is what we value utmost. Two, that when you do think about the consequences of your actions, you take into account that the happiness of everybody is equal. That seems like the most fair thing to do. So let's apply this to the famous Robin Hood story, right? Where, if you're not familiar with it, Robin Hood is a person that steals from the rich and gives to the poor. If you are following utilitarianism, is Robin Hood's actions moral? Is it moral to steal from the rich to give to the poor? Well, to the extent that you steal from the rich and provide much more happiness to the poor, you should be able to justify this, right, as being the right action, because the little that you steal from the rich will hardly affect the rich. They won't feel the loss of, a certain amount you steal from them, yet that amount could be shared and spread to all of these poor people who would get lots of joy, lots of happiness, whose lives would be much better off. So you could apply utilitarianism to this action and say, yes, Robin Hood's behavior is moral. Can you start to see some possible objections to this sort of moral reasoning, right? For the utilitarian, morality is, right actions are that which promotes the greatest well-being and happiness. They value well-being and happiness the utmost. And what should you do? You should do that, always do that, which brings about the most happiness, which brings about the most well-being. So what sorts of issues might you raise? Well, some people will say, look, if I'm obligated, if I must always do that which brings about the most happiness, won't I always be doing acts to benefit the most people all the time? Which means I'll be like exhausted, right? If if I have to, right? If I'm morally obligated to just do that which brings about the most happiness, I'll never rest, because every moment that I'm choosing to rest is a moment I could have chosen to do something that's of benefit to other people or more people. What might a utilitarian say about this? Well, they might say, look, you need to rest every once in a while. That act actually would promote the most happiness, because by resting, you give yourself more energy, you put yourself in a state which allows you to be more useful to other people. What do you think? Do you buy that? Another objection is that utilitarianism seems to imply situations where you're gonna go against what you think is the right thing to do. You're gonna go against your moral duty. For instance, if there's a situation where telling the truth and telling a lie both bring about the same amount of happiness, where they bring about the same amount of well-being, according to utilitarianism, it's actually not better to tell the truth, right? Because it's all about the consequences, not about the act itself, not about some moral duty to always tell the truth. No. If telling the truth brings about the same happiness as telling a lie, then it's not any better. How does that sit with you? Or think about the situation with like a peeping Tom. So here's a peeping Tom, and he gets great pleasure, right, in peeping into windows and seeing women undress. If the women never find out, if nobody ever finds out, what does utilitarianism say about this person's action? He's not hurting anybody, right? He gets great joy from it. By him peeping into windows, he creates more happiness in the world. He feels better in life. Isn't this justified then, as long as nobody gets hurt, as long as nobody sees him? Does that fit okay with you? For the utilitarian, they would say, look, our our moral biases, we're going to have to change them. We're going to have to realize that what's more important is utility. What's more important is just general happiness. So yeah, it might feel weird, but it doesn't mean it's wrong. Third objection, there's an objection from integrity. Let's say you are helping a lady out, your neighbor who's elderly, and they have difficulty taking care of themselves, and you develop a good bond, a trust between the two of you. And upon her deathbed, she gives you a bag of money that she's been saving up, and she says, "Hey, could you? I really need you to help me and deliver this to my nephew, in another town when I pass." right? And you say, okay, I'll do it for you, right? Sure, I'll give the money to your nephew when you pass, right? It's the dying wish of your neighbor. And then she passes, and then you have the bag of money that you can give to the nephew, but the nephew isn't, poor. The nephew isn't, in need of the money. He's just doing fine. And you realize that as you're driving, there's so many people in your community that could really use this, right? So many people that could use an extra sandwich or a new blanket what's the right thing to do? If you're a utilitarian, you would say, yeah, there's obviously a lot more ways in which you could use the money that would create more utility. That would be better for the society, right? That would bring about the more happiness. So you would be justified in actually not delivering the money. But what about integrity? You promised her that you would do it. Doesn't it feel like you should keep your word? Well, for the utilitarian, they might respond by saying integrity is not an absolute, right? We might have to compromise our integrity if it would bring about more happiness. How does that sit with you? And think about some absurd situation where you are a physician and you see all of these patients in your hospital that are in desperate need for a heart or a lung or a liver or a kidney, right? And they're going to die without those transplants. And then you get a healthy person come in, for I don't know, a headache or a cold, and they have a healthy heart and a healthy lung and a healthy kidney. Isn't there a way that you could justify killing this healthy person because you could use their body parts to bring about even more happiness by saving the lives of all these other people? Wouldn't utilitarianism allow for that? And maybe even say you should do that? Hmm. You don't even have to go that extreme, right? Couldn't utilitarianism be used to justify things like slavery or prostitution? Couldn't this be used to justify just about anything, right? Because we're not worried about the morality of the act. Utilitarianism is just worried about the consequence. So if more people are happier in the community if we have slaves, doesn't utilitarianism seem to then justify slavery? If the community were more happy if we enslaved women to be prostitutes, doesn't utilitarianism give you a way to justify that? Or something like infanticide. If there was a way to justify killing innocent babies, right, because it would, feed the community, does that sit well with you? Just because it brings about the most happiness? Now, for the utilitarian, they might respond by saying, look, justice is not an absolute, but under our principle, under our moral reasoning, it actually would make sense to have certain moral laws, right? Like no slavery or no prostitution or no killing of innocent babies. Under utilitarianism, we should have those laws because having those laws brings about more utility. Well, I mean, you could say that, but then is it really a consequentialist philosophy? Is it even utilitarianism anymore? Because now we're basing our ethic on moral laws, on a moral principle, right? That seems like a different sort of philosophy that we'll get into next week. But maybe the biggest problem, maybe the biggest objection to utilitarianism is it requires you to think about the consequences and figure out which actions bring about the better ones, the better results. How do you do that math? Is that math even possible to do? How do you figure out if this act would bring about more happiness than another act? Is it really that clear cut? I mean, if we take a look at a trolley situation, is it really clear cut that by pulling the lever, we'd bring about more happiness? I mean, what if those 5 people tied onto the track are like really old and they're, close to death? And the one person tied down is relatively young, where they have so much more of their lives to live. Can't you justify not pulling the lever and allowing the train to run over the 5 because the amount of happiness you'd save isn't that much? They're going to die soon anyway, right? Or how do you know that this one person on the track isn't tied and so closely responsible for the happiness of a bunch of other people, so that if you were to allow them to die, all of these other people they're connected with would experience such great grief and their quality of lives would be so dramatically affected. Maybe they have a large family, maybe they're a key member, a leader within a community. And if you allow them to be killed, then you are dramatically negatively influencing the community that this one person is in, versus the 5 who may not be as connected or may not be as responsible for the well-being of others. How would you do that? How could you even know? Is it possible to do the math? So maybe it's not the consequence of the action. Maybe we have to take a look at our moral principles and see whether or not an act in and of itself is the right or wrong thing to do.